What single human has done the most damage to the progression of humanity in the history of mankind? Guy de Chauliac. He was a surgeon in the 1300s who vehemently spoke out against another fellow surgeon, Theodoric Borgognoni. Theodoric was a surgeon who wrote about his theories on proper wound care and believed that the best thing you can do to a wound is wrap it and keep it clean. Guy hated what Theodoric was writing because it directly went against the teachings of Galen, an ancient Greek surgeon who believed pus was the body's way of balancing your humors. Guy's teachings were widely accepted, and it's believed that his ignorance set the development of antisepsis in surgery back about 600 years. Ignaz Semmelweis was the guy who was thrown into a mental asylum for saying surgeons should wash their hands between seeing patients. Op is compiling a hit list for their time-traveling journeys. I just want to talk with them. Purportedly, the unnamed inventor of flexible glass, Vitrum Flexil, brought a drinking bowl made of the material before Tiberius Caesar. The bowl was put through a test to break it, but it merely dented, rather than shattering. The inventor repaired the bowl easily with a small hammer, according to Petronius. After the inventor swore that he was the only man alive who knew the manufacturing technique, Tiberius had the man executed. He feared that the glass would devalue gold and silver, since the material might be more valuable. Robert Maxwell, father of Ghislaine. The man was the leading cause of paywalled scientific articles today. Before him, science publishing was relatively open. He helped shape the industry into the cancer on academia it is today. The Doctor version is that through use of PR marketing, exclusivity deals, and copyright law, Maxwell through Pergamon Press turned scientific publishing from a relatively non-profit-driven endeavor to a predatory industry that charged institutions out the nose for research they paid nothing for. I would suggest Andrew Wakefield. His work ileal-lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children has been directly responsible for the mistrust of vaccines, the decline of Western rates of vaccination, and basically telling everybody that there's a boogeyman underneath your bed. He is directly responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths. He's a scientist who made a mistake. Why are you blaming him? It's not that he made a mistake. He had purposely customized the outcomes to meet the hypothesis so that he could get rich selling safe vaccines and diagnostic kits. He poisoned the well that saved so many people just so he could get rich. I have no idea how he can sleep at night. Emperor Zhezong of China. This is kind of an obscure story, so let me tell you the whole thing. It was the 12th century. When people talk about how China used to be the most technologically advanced part of the world, this is the period they're talking about. Some historians that they were on the brink of industrializing. Then Manchuria invaded and conquered northern China. The imperial court retreated to the south and declared Zhezong, the emperor's brother, as the new emperor. China's top general Yue Fei, who, according to some records, literally had patriotism tattooed on his back, though that might have been made up by someone who wanted to emphasize how unfair the rest of this story is, rallied his army and defeated the Manchus, and was raring to chase them out. But he gets orders from Zhezong to back down, because he'd rather negotiate. These negotiations end up signing away the north half of China. A few years later, the Manchus invade again. Yue Fei beats them again and pushes all the way back to the old capital, Kaifeng. Then he gets the order to retreat. He responds with a letter saying that he's got the Manchus on the ropes, and he can reconquer northern China in like a month. No, says the emperor, retreat immediately. Eventually, Yue Fei does retreat, but he delays long enough to evacuate the city first, making up some logistical issues as an excuse. At this point, you may be wondering why Zhezong was so reluctant to push an advantage. The answer is that his brother was still alive. The king of Manchuria liked to bring him out once in a while and make fun of him. If Yue Fei reconquered China, he might liberate the rightful emperor, and Zhezong would be out of a job. As such, Zhezong was actively trying to throw the war. And he interpreted Yue Fei's delay at the end of this war as meaning that he had reached the point of at least considering going rogue, so as soon as Yue Fei got back, he was arrested, and promptly executed on treason on the ground of he might have done something. Presumably because the optics on the actual charge, almost winning a war we wanted to lose, were too bad. People realize that this is bull quickly enough, and there are protests, but Zhezong manages to pin everything on one of his advisors and placated the mob by executing him. So how does this affect the long-term progression of humanity? Well, as I said, China might have been on the brink of industrializing at the time, but didn't have access to enough coal. There are coal deposits in China, but they're all in the north. Second, the Manchus never really got their internal issues sorted out, and 70 years later, were easily conquered by the Mongols, who then recruited a bunch of disaffected Chinese siege engineers. This essentially removed the one weakness of horse archer hordes: they're not good at taking fortresses, and allowed them to wreck half the world. Had China been united at the time, and had been ruled fairly recently by a guy who had, if you recall, been taken prisoner by invaders from the north, so you can bet the defenses would be fairly well maintained, they probably could not have done this. So had it not been for the malice of this one man, the Mongols would probably never have become the juggernaut they eventually did, and the Industrial Revolution might have happened about 500 years ahead of schedule. Yongle, Emperor of the Ming Dynasty in China, ordered the fleet of Zheng, the greatest trading and exploration fleet of the time, to be burned during his reign in the early 1400s. This was the beginning of an era of isolation for Chinese kingdoms, which ultimately led to the collapse of Imperial China, and indirectly to the rise of the PRC. Additionally, the wealth of the world overall decreased as a result of reduced trade with China, and if China had continued exploring, it is possible that they, not Europeans, would have colonized North America, instead of merely maybe discovering it then telling no one as they did in history. It may not be a significant alteration of human progress, but it's one of those events that sets the world in a definitively different direction. Thomas Midgley Jr. in 1921. This guy that discovered that tetraethyl lead could be used as an anti-knocking fuel additive for cars. It satisfied the needs of oil companies at the time, because it worked, was cheap, and was patentable, for that purpose. But it was also incredibly toxic, and burning leaded gasoline was hugely pollutive. Eventually, after the creation of the EPA and an oil crisis in the mid-70s, leaded gas was banned in 1996, but the damage was done. Interestingly, the guy didn't even show up for the occasion when the first customer filled up their car with leaded gas, because he was at home, sick with lead poisoning. Sheikh al-Islam. I heard of this guy after hearing someone on TV complain about how this man set the Islamic world back by centuries. In 1515, the age of the Ottoman Empire, he, a learned scholar of the kingdom, issued a decree that forbid printing, press, and made using it punishable by death. In the year 1515, Sheikh al-Islam of the Ulama, learned scholars, issued a fatwa that printing was haram, forbidden. As a result, Ottoman Sultan Selim I issued a decree of a death penalty on anyone using the printing press. The fatwa has been attributed as one of the reasons for the stagnation of knowledge, invention and discovery in the Muslim world, at a time when Europe was in the midst of the Renaissance period. It seems that Sheikh al-Islam is a title though, not a name. And we would have known for sure though, if there were any books about it. Bhakti Khilji. Hands down. In 12th century there was the world's biggest university in India named Nalanda, where intellectuals from all around the world used to study. Then Turks invaded India under Khilji. They killed almost all the intellectuals and destroyed the university. And they burnt the library. The library continued to burn for 3 months. This has to be by far the biggest loss to mankind. Same as Sunny Ali. Songhai king who couldn't read or write, and this inferiority complex led him to conquer and burn down Timbuktu and killing all scholars that didn't manage to escape. A leader with an inferiority complex destroying things? That's some wild history. Surely that wouldn't happen today. History is stuck on repeat. Sir Mark Sykes. This man was the British element in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. For those of you not in the know, 100 years ago the Middle East was an area that did have some nations and some more tribal areas. So people were more divided by language and culture, some by religion. France and Britain decided to carve up the Middle East into easier to govern territories, but fumbled this task and instead divided the territories on the map over these religious and tribal lines. Not only has this been a main contributing cause of conflict in the Middle East, if you take two opposing or rival groups and then suddenly group them as one country, what do you expect? But said conflicts have then fueled further conflicts again and again. This has then been further used by Islamic extremists as a reason to hate the Western powers, as they were the ones who created this terrible agreement. Even Sykes himself accepted that the agreement's wording should be changed in order to give those countries autonomous rule. What is a little sad is he actually seemed to want to help these regions with the agreement, but just bumbled the whole thing, which has led to most of the issues the Middle East has to this day. Sykes didn't make the modern Middle East though, he just played a large part in creating the circumstances in which its current problems thrive. Imagine all of the advancement, education and collaboration that could have happened had the Middle East been allowed to flourish unhindered and without resentment. The problem is Sykes-Picot fucked it up so badly that if you look at a tribal or religious map of the time, it's so bad that it looks intentional. Like, not a single country that's unified by anything. It's so bad that it looks intentional. Well, it was lol same with Africa and India. When your enemies are stable unified nations, they can't easily be exploited, it's just divide and rule. Divide and conquer was a long-standing strategy for British colonial powers. Split up groups, favor one ethnic group over another within the new divisions, use them to support your rule. The Middle East and Africa as a whole have dozens of examples of this. It's British propaganda to suggest that they were simply incompetent. It was absolutely intentional, along the lines of keep them fighting among themselves and it will be easier to manage our interests. If anyone knows anything about the British Empire, they know it was intentional. This was Britain's entire MO and the reason they became such a huge empire, playing off local populations and exploiting local rivalries and power dynamics to take over regions. Genghis Khan. While he personally didn't do much to hinder human progress, his reign began an era of Mongol expansionism and devastation, and his successors were responsible for the destruction of the House of Wisdom of Baghdad, ending the Islamic Golden Age, and not to mention the destruction of numerous cities and the deaths of many. Also, the Mongol Empire eventually paved the way for the Black Death. The empire led to many trade routes being formed between Europe and Asia, which eventually led to the transmission of the Black Death to Europe in the 14th century. As terrible as the Black Death was, it was actually the primary driver of change that led Europe out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. The Renaissance basically kick-started modern civilization. The Black Death led to a great questioning of the old certainties. This led many, especially among the urban elite, to use reason to understand the world. The high mortality rate resulted in a drastic decline in the labor force. Wages rose for both agricultural and urban workers. The survivors of the Black Death generally had a higher standard of living than before the plague. This phenomenon occurred in both urban and rural areas. The crisis caused by the Black Death led to many changes in the economy in response to the fall in the population. Because of the labor shortages, there was a move from labor-intensive farming such as cereal to livestock and an increase in industry and agriculture, more labor-saving devices employed. In the period after the Black Death, an unprecedented amount of social mobility took place. Laborers became merchants, and merchants become members of the nobility. No longer was a person's destiny to be fixed by their birth. Previously, people assumed that one's station was fixed at one's birth and that one had to remain a member of the class you were born into. People believed that a peasant would always be a peasant, an aristocrat, and an aristocrat. Italians, like other peoples, in Europe, believed that one's birth determined one's future and that this was determined by God. However, as social mobility became more widespread because of the Black Death, many people believed that a person's merits or abilities were what mattered and not one's birth.